slightly violent shifting of gears here, because we're going from really a wonderful, and I hope you guys find it as uplifting as you, sort of academic accomplishment, to this extremely powerful movie and really powerful story about profound struggle against terrible odds. And it connects to so many of the themes, I think, Steve, that we've been hearing about this morning around early childhood development, around the question of the competency of the classroom, of teaching to overcome extraordinary obstacles particularly in high poverty schools. And I'd love you just to start out by providing the background for this movie. Who were these kids? How did you come to be involved with them?
Sure. So, can folks hear me? So in the fall of 1988, there was a wealthy businessman out in Silver Spring named Steve Bumbaugh who provided funding to essentially start a school within a school. At that time, there were 170 public schools in Washington, D.C., and Kramer Junior High School was ranked 170th. It had the dubious honor of being the worst school in arguably the worst school system in the United States. So Mr. Bumbaugh decided to adopt half of the incoming class of Kramer Junior High School and essentially create a micro school for them until they graduated from high school 6 years later. I was really fortunate to be one of the staff persons in that project. And it happened, I joined pretty shortly after graduating from college.
And tell us a little bit about what the kids were experiencing, the neighborhood that they were coming from. What were the conditions like in Anacostia at the time?
So for old heads who've been around D.C. for a while, you probably remember that in the 80s and 90s we were known as the murder capital. It was the height of the drug war, and Washington, D.C. had the highest homicide rate in the United States. The zip code where my students lived was the highest homicide zip code in the United States. So there was a tremendous amount of addiction, a tremendous amount of violence. It was just, I described what I saw during my time there as a low-level civil war.
Did you know what to expect when you walked into the school on the first day?
No. I am from D.C., and Southeast was always this sort of mythological place that you didn't go to. But I was always curious about it. I didn't exactly know what to expect. In fact, the very first day that I was there, I had blood all over my new shirt before I ever set foot in a classroom. So that kind of teed up some of the challenges we were going to experience over the next few years.
And in fact, there's a wonderful moment in the documentary where one of the kids is reflecting on that, seeing Steve covered in blood on day one, and them saying to each other, he's not going to last 5 days here. And in fact, all these years later, you're still deeply involved in these now grown-ups, their lives. So we've got a couple clips where we want to show you. Let's go to the first one in just a second. Maybe Steve, tell us a little bit about Antoine Green, who I think is the subject of the first clip.
Yeah, Antoine Green was one of these really charismatic kids who could just walk into a room and be comfortable and shake everybody's hand. He was very intellectually gifted and came from a very unstable home, and he talks about it in the film. There was violence, there was drug abuse, and he carried a lot of the challenges of his home into the classroom, which was typical of a lot of our students.
So let's go ahead and show that clip. There are monitors, I think, on either side.
It was like 7th to 8th grade. We were like evicted. Me and my mom, we actually moved into a shelter. Now, that was depressing in its own right. I couldn't really tell anybody because You didn't want to be teased, and the situation was bad. She actually had a baby, another baby, while we were there. There's 6 kids altogether. I thought she was making her situation worse because it's hard for us. We barely getting by. How can we take care of another person? My stepdad, he was an alcoholic. He was a drug addict. Abusive, he did. You can't study for a test with all this going on. I was nervous, but at that time I'm thinking, okay, well, we're going to college anyway, so we're going to have to leave, so it might as well get a start on it. And so I'm like, okay, yeah. I'm like, I can do this. It's like, we don't have no distraction. It's only study time. I can apply myself, and plus don't tell me I can't, because I can do anything. If I put my mind to it, I believe I can do anything.
See, that's what I'm saying. See, he's smart. He went out there. Someone challenged him, said something like he didn't deserve to be there, and he got.
From right there, it was the defining moment. I changed everything. I studied. I didn't play basketball. I studied. I passed every test. I did every single class. I worked my tail off. Every single class, I got in all A's.
And it was one of the proudest moments in the whole program. Antoine Green, this kid we knew could do this, he was doing it.
Like, I catch on so fast. It was like, I was catching on so fast. I'm like, this stuff is easy. We take the test, it's literally absolutely the same thing I just studied. It was like, man, this is like I'm cheating. I'm like, I knew I wanted to be an attorney. I can see the future. I can see it crystal clear that, now I'm saying colleges, I know where I want to go. I know how I need my grades to be.
It was an amazing transformation. And then it all fell apart.
So I don't think we can leave people hanging on that. How did it fall apart for Antoine? What happened?
So there were a couple of things that happened. As Antoine described, his home situation was very difficult, and he was the oldest of 6 kids. He was a pretty big kid himself, and he viewed himself as the provider for his younger siblings, some of whom were literally in diapers when he left to go to Ohio.
And I'm not sure, did the clip make it clear this was a boarding school in Ohio? This is an incredible shift for...
So we took 10 of our students and sent them to a boarding school that was essentially all white in rural Ohio and was Seventh-day Adventist. So it was interesting. But again, if you were around D.C. at that time, that is what we considered was the best and most plausible option for them because they were in danger. So because we had a very close and trusting relationship with Antoine, we convinced him that in spite of the fact that he viewed himself as the provider for siblings who were in diapers and for his mother, who was in an abusive relationship, he trusted us when we told him he was going to be able to best provide for them, if he went to this boarding school in rural Ohio. He went there, as he described, made this incredible transformation, and actually he was working on his potential, which is rare for people to do. But he always had the pressure at home, knowing the relationship between his mother and his stepfather, always kind of listening to the voices of his little sister when she called to get some hint of what was going on. That was a lot of pressure for him. And then I think the straw that broke the camel's back was that they had a Sadie Hawkins dance at that school. And one of the white students asked him to go to the dance, and the adults at the school went bananas. And I think at that point he decided they didn't want him there. He felt that he was needed back home. So he vaporized on us. He disappeared, was out on the street selling drugs, got himself arrested and locked up. Should I go through the whole?
I think you should tell the whole story.
Yeah,
'cause
he's
it's
so
amazing.
Antoine, I call Antoine a modern-day Odysseus. So he goes from getting D's and F's at Kramer Junior High School to getting straight A's at a boarding school to dropping out and selling drugs on the streets of Southeast in the 90s, which was a very short-term occupation in those days. Got arrested. A judge said, "I see something in you, and I'm going to give you a second chance." He took the second chance. He said he never wanted to be in that position again. Got a job driving a truck at a Coca-Cola plant. Realized he could do this on his own and make a lot more money. Fast forward, Anton now has a fleet of 8 trucks, makes well into the 6 figures, has a big house in Columbia, Maryland. His son is in a PhD program. His daughter's in college. He's just got this Odysseus-like experience, an incredible life he's led.
In the movie, he's sending his kid off to China to study for a year, right? He's studying Mandarin, and it's extraordinary.
It's amazing. Yeah.
And an incredible demonstration of resilience, really. How did you, the Dreamer program set out with this ambition to get all these kids to college right away. In the end, how many of the kids did actually go to school?
So one of the well-intentioned mistakes that we made, and we made a lot of well-intentioned mistakes, was to unconsciously take this middle-class template about college and superimpose it in this community that wasn't middle class. So we expected all 67 of our students to graduate on time from high school and then immediately enroll in a 4-year college or university where they would be in a dorm. I think pretty quickly we realized that was not realistic. We sent, I think 39 of our 67 kids immediately went off to college. After 5 years, only 6 had earned degrees. What's interesting is that now, right now, 20 years later, if I have my numbers correct, we have 9 of our students currently enrolled in college, and we have another 7 or 8 who earned degrees in that interim time. So the circumstances of their life were sufficiently different from mine growing up that the whole approach to college just needed to be different.
I mean, how many of the kids around them were going to school outside the program?
Virtually none. So we had an interesting benchmark for them, which was that they were half of a class that was selected. So I tracked the stats on the other half of the class. Only, I think, 27% of whom graduated on time from high school, and almost none of whom went on to college.
We should say the staffing of this program was you and a teacher.
We had 2 FTEs, and then we had a team of tutors who would come in.
Do you want to tell a little bit about Phyllis Rumbarger and what her role was?
Yeah, so a woman named Phyllis Rumbarger and I ran the day-to-day operations of the program, and Phyllis was an interesting character. She was 30 years my senior, so she was in her 50s. She lived in Potomac, Maryland. She had been a teacher for 30 years, was a masterful instructor, and she was a wealthy white woman arriving in Southeast Washington, D.C. at 7:30 in the morning every day for 6 years, which was unusual. And the kids accepted her pretty quickly, and so did the parents. And I think I can say the same with me. And we all worked together very closely year-round, long days, and built this long-term, trusting set of relationships that I think was the core of the things that did work well with the program.
Let's set up the next clip, which focuses on Tenille Warren. she's quoted elsewhere in the documentary, I don't think in this clip, as saying, in response to a question, she says, so school, reflecting on her childhood, no, that was not important to me, not even a little bit. To talk a little bit about the environment she was coming from.
Yeah, so Tennille was this wayfish, tiny kid who just looked so vulnerable that to me, she became, I don't know if anybody here is or has been a teacher, we're not supposed to play favorites, but she was one of my favorites because I knew that she was this tiny kid living in a particularly horrible public housing project called Simple City. There were just murders everywhere, and she was abused in her house, and I knew that. So it was very difficult for her to concentrate on school. The gift that she had, the thing that everybody recognized about Tennille, is that she was an extraordinary artist. So the way our program tried to hook her into school and make it relevant was to send her to the Duke Ellington School for the Arts.
All right, why don't we watch that clip now?
You were one of the only dreamers I hadn't met before the first day of school. Like, I don't know exactly what I said, but it was something like, Tennille Warren, Tennille the Great, nice to meet you. How are you?
And I responded like,
You gave me a limp handshake.
because you
and
probably scared me.
And you didn't look me in the eye, and then you
gave me a hard way to go for the first few months.
For the first few months or the next 10 years?
The first few months.
It didn't matter that this one person comes along when I'm about 12 years old and starts trying to tell me, you can do this, you can be great, you're awesome, you're talented, you're smart, you can do whatever you put your heart to. And I'm like, what is this guy talking about?
You wouldn't even talk.
I didn't have to talk. I expressed myself clearly.
Okay. So shy. Now she's out the closet, bloom like a flower. I mean, Jesus.
I got a lot to say now. I held back.
Yeah, she's making up for lost time.
Yes, exactly.
I was on 18 for minutes.
After a while, I had accepted he's not going anywhere. He's relentless. He's not giving up.
You went to catch him? I thought you went to war.
The harder I tried to push him away, the harder he worked to try and build me up.
Well, we do have some better news along the east side of town. We do have 2nd Avenue now reopened at 42nd Street, and 35th Street has been reopened too, westbound between the area of 2nd and 3rd.
In 1994, I was too young at that age to understand how long it takes for some seeds to germinate.
Reopened at 42nd Street, and 35th Street has been reopened too.
Hello?
Hey, Tennille Warren, how are you?
I'm fine. You should have FaceTimed me. The Tennille I know, she wouldn't have done this. She'd have stayed on her register and just said exactly what the job said to say. Hi, paper or plastic. It just was tiresome, and I was like, I'm doing everything but being an artist. And that's what I was trying to do when I even began this whole thing.
Well, that's what you're doing. That's why you're getting on this plane today, right?
Now that we're a quarter century removed from the time these 12-year-olds were adopted into the program, I feel like it was wildly successful.
Florence. I have more courage than I believe I did. I have more faith and hope than I could imagine. And I don't want to hold back anymore.
There's a lot of information missing from that. Actually, why you pushed her to go to Duke Ellington. She says in the film that she basically hated you for the first couple of years she was there. The last year she kind of got it and apparently really enjoyed the experience, yet she decided not to go on to college right away. What'd she do instead, and why?
So because Tennille had such a difficult upbringing and experienced so much abuse inside of her home, she was just tired, and she didn't want to take on another really tiring experience. She had just gotten a job at a Safeway in Arlington that paid her union wages. They offered to hire her full-time, and she did the math and figured out she could get an apartment and just get some rest. And so that's what she did for several years instead of going to college.
And to some degree, she was helping her mom during that period too, right? And there was some.
She was helping lots of people in her family, yeah.
And so what was it that reignited her imagination and suddenly gave her this sense that, and explain what she then did, actually.
Yeah, so she had experienced success as an artist at Duke Ellington. She was recognized as someone who's extraordinarily talented. And I think she got the rest she needed at Duke Ellington and decided it was time to get back to work. So she applied to the best fashion college in the country. It's called the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. She got rejected twice. After the second rejection, she called for a meeting for them to explain why she got rejected. They told her why. She filled all the gaps. She was admitted, and now she's there. And this young woman is so tenacious. You know, New York is expensive, that she actually moved into a homeless shelter while she was attending FIT just to make it work. And the clip that we just saw was her flying to Florence to do a semester abroad there.
Yeah, watching this document, there's just so much talk about the importance of grit and resilience in kids these days, and you watch this documentary and you think, boy, the one thing these kids do not lack is grit. I mean, in case after case, the toughness is incredible.
So I think for anybody who works in education or works in poor communities in general, one of the things that becomes clear really quickly is that any person who is able to work their way out of poverty has tremendous grit and resiliency. And Antoine and Tennille's stories in isolation sound amazing, but we could pluck a name out of a hat of our 67 students and find similar stories. And you could go to poor neighborhoods around the country, and when you talk to those people who've made their way out, these are the kinds of sacrifices that they have to make.
How much contact are you having with this class these days?
So thanks to Facebook and the internet, we're all in regular contact with each other. I communicate in some fashion with, we call the students our dreamers. I communicate in some fashion with a dreamer almost every day.
Amazing. I'm going to open it up to you guys in a second, but there are a couple more questions I wanted to ask Steve first. One is, these kids were going to middle school at the height of the crack epidemic in Washington, and the conditions were particularly appalling in a lot of ways. We've also seen years of renewed focused effort on improving educational outcomes across the city. Do you think it's as hard for kids today in similar high poverty neighborhoods as it was for the dreamers? Should we think any differently about the conditions, the circumstances that they're in now?
The conditions are better, both sort of socially on the ground and in terms of education. But I would say when the starting point was Southeast D.C. in the 80s and 90s, that's an unacceptable starting point. And I would say where we are now, both in terms of the social conditions and educational options, it's still unacceptable, even though they are substantially better than they were then. that we didn't have charter schools back then. There was really no such thing as school choice in the 80s and 90s. Now, some of my higher performing students could have gone to a KIP or a DC prep or some of the higher performing charters. That didn't exist back then. But Washington, D.C. still has amongst the highest high school dropout rates and the lowest NAEP scores in the United States. So we are far from cracking this nut. We have a long way to go.
So what do you see as the lessons from this experience for people who are working today in high poverty schools?
I think what you see a lot of now, which is important, is an emphasis on governance structures and on instructional models. And all that stuff is important. What we emphasized was relationships. We could get our kids to come to school at much higher rates than the kids outside of our program. And we tripled the graduation rate because we had these really deeply trusting relationships with the students and with their parents. And I think if there's one, our program was not ideal by any stretch of the imagination, but if there's one lesson from our program that I would like to see scaled, it is the emphasis on deep relationships with students and their parents and involving them in the architecture of the program.
Questions from the audience? I think there are a couple microphones circulating. Yes, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Oops. My Nora Morales, and I am with the Mid-Atlantic Equity Center. We're one of 10 regional technical assistance centers for the U.S. Department of Education. First of all, thank you very much for sharing with us your experiences. And as an equity person, I'm very much interested in systemic reform at the policy level and also in practice for practitioners. One of our targets is to provide technical assistance to SEAs and LEAs. So my question to you is, we've heard a lot today about grit and SEL and the things that we must impart on students. But in listening to your stories about your students, there's a part of me that is kind of enraged. I'm enraged because we are coming out with more and more things for students to learn as opposed to reflecting on the questions of us and the collective in this room that have privilege, what we can do to make things more level for them. So for you in your position, my question is, what would you suggest that policymakers, practitioners, and those of us who hold power can do to help make those lives easier for those kids?
So thank you for your question, and I'm enraged too, and that's really why I continue to do this work, is because it is enraging. I think that one of the things people in a room like this can do is we have all kinds of terminology that reflects the symptoms that we see. So, for example, the achievement gap is a symptom. And what we tend to do in this work is jump from a symptom that we recognize to some sort of intervention. If we were oncologists, when we see a symptom, our next step would be to try to investigate the underlying cause. And I don't think we do that nearly as much as we could or should in education. So to me, with the achievement gap, for example, before we jump into what we can do to ameliorate the achievement gap, we should ask, why does it exist? What are the underlying causes for the achievement gap? How did it come to be that African American students and Latino students score at rates that are consistently so much lower than white students? And to me, if you take that piece out of a logical process, what you're doing often is you're experimenting, and you have ad hoc, not necessarily evidence-based reforms because you haven't actually gathered the evidence. That's just one thing. One other thing I would say is that you can't reform a system from the outside. And even in an event like this, I don't know all the people that are going to be on the days, but there should be students on the days. There should be parents. There should be people from the communities that we're working in actually telling us what they need and what works for them.
There's another hand here.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Zachary Goldman. I'm a doctoral student at GW, and I'm chief education intern at YSA. Someday I'll be paid. But two questions. First off, how do you reconciliate the differences between your goals of academic achievement and human development for your students? And secondly, in terms of methodology in your program, did you follow traditional methods of instruction? Did you differentiate? How did you go about reaching the students method-wise?
Thank you for that question. And GW's School of Urban Planning did a lot of work with our program. They did a great job. They developed a course for our kids, so I'm always a big fan of GW. So I don't actually see the issue of human development and academic development as being mutually exclusive. I think that they're symbiotic. And I think one of the things we did do well with our limited expertise, neither my coworker nor I were clinically trained, was try to put our students in positions where they could be successful, whether that was in arts or in athletics or in something that might not be academically related. And as a result, that was a draw to school. It was something that made school relevant. It was something that made the effort of doing the math worksheet before the Friday round robin basketball tournament tenable for our kids. What was your second question? Oh, sure. Yeah, so we did not have sophisticated methodology. Phyllis Rumbarger was a very skillful instructor, and she taught me how to lesson plan and such. But we were doing differentiation before that term, before I was aware that term existed. And we had the ability to have more than one lesson going on simultaneously because our class sizes were so small. I usually had, if I had 8 kids in my class, that was a lot. So that sort of format lended itself to personalized instruction, and that worked very well for us.
And you also had, you were working with these kids through the summers, and you were showing them kind of a different Washington, really, than they'd otherwise experienced.
Yeah, so back in those days, Mayor Marion Barry had something called the Summer Youth Employment Program, SYEP, and we worked with his administration to essentially turn that money over to us, and we would place kids in jobs. So we were placing kids, we would have placed them at the Atlantic. We placed them in downtown, K Street, white-collar, professional offices. We had academic remediation in the summertime. It was a really, we tried to be as holistic as two people possibly could.
Over here, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Ebony Rose Thompson. I work for America's Promise, but I'm actually a native Washingtonian.
All right.
My zip code is probably similar to many of your student zip codes. My
20020?
I'm 20019.
Okay, close.
So right next door. And I grew up in D.C. in, I guess, the 80s and 90s. I'm curious to know, you mentioned parents and families being able to tell us what they need.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had the benefit of my family was able to take advantage of choice. I went to the Seed School, which is actually a public boarding school. But I wonder often the students who most need it, if they're really able to take advantage of choice and what their parents or what schools as community centers are able to do in preparing their parents to take advantage of different choice solutions, as well as participating in conversations like this. Because there's a lot that you need before you can go out and advocate for what you actually need for day to day. So what are some of the things that I guess communities, cities can put in place to be able to better prepare families to take advantage of both the choice solutions and advocating for themselves on a citywide scale?
So I first, you know what I want to do? I want to recognize your boss, because the CEO of America's Promise, he and his wife were the two very best mentors we had in our program. I've known them for over 25 years, and they practically adopted one of our students, and John Gompertz is just a wonderful man. I think you're right that, well, first of all, as you well know, low-income black communities are not homogeneous places. Everybody's not the same, and everybody doesn't have the same experience. So there were some, and Antoine and Tennille are examples of this, really particularly difficult situations that some of these kids faced at home. And in today's choice environment, I doubt that their parents would have been able to find a charter school for them to go to. So I suspect, and I'm saying this, I don't have the evidence to support this, but I suspect that families like that probably are underrepresented in the choice schools that we have today. I think that's a very difficult, I mean, that's, I think, part of what you give up when you have choice, right? Before, you just had to go to your neighborhood school, whether it was good or whether it was terrible. Now you have a lot of choices. There is not a lot of architecture in place to help people make informed choices. I would like to see better systems in place, just a hand sheet for parents to say, this is what you should be looking for in a school when you're making a choice. There should basic 5 points that they should be looking for when they're going into schools. I'm not sure that exists, and so I think often the schools that are able to drum up demand, often it's because they're really good marketers. And I think there are all kinds of solutions to informing parents about what a good school looks like or what good schools look like is a really critical step to taking advantage of choice.
Over here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Wood Jeffries. I'm with Higher Achievement, and actually your question is a good segue to mine because our program combines mentoring with choice, among many other things. Our mentors focused on middle school, actually at Kramer Middle School where these students were, and many other schools in the area, help work with our scholars and families to get them into the best choices for high school. But my question is more about where you see the future and present of mentoring programs in the district and beyond. There's the Empowering Males of Color initiative, of course, which we're part of and Kaya's strongly behind. But I see there being huge potential for everyone in this room and many more beyond these walls to get involved as mentors to help build those relationships, also to tighten the social fabric of our city at this time of tremendous change. So I'd just love to hear your reflections on mentoring now in the district.
So it would, speaking as an idealist, it would really be nice if we didn't view academics and mentoring as separate entities. If it was really baked into the DNA of a school, that would be a wonderful thing. That being said, there's a lot of science behind mentoring. It's not just the old model where you meet a kid and you take her to ice skate on Saturday, or you take him to a Nats game on Sunday. It's really requires, there's an evidence-based trainings behind how to be a really effective mentor. In fact, there's a place in Oakland, California called the Mentoring Center that was founded by a man named Martin Jacks that, as far as I know, provides, well, I will say provides really best-in-class instruction on how to be an effective mentor in low-income communities. And I would love to see organizations like that really working in DCPS and in our charter movement and in cities beyond.
Steve, I have a question, and I'm embarrassed that I have to ask this. I don't know the answer myself. How can people watch the movie? How can we tell this group that they can actually go out and see this documentary?
Well, it just so happens that I brought cards from the filmmaker. So someone can instruct me where to place them, and folks can feel free to pick up a postcard with links to the filmmaker, and you can see the film at your leisure.
And I'm no film critic, but I certainly do recommend that you see this movie if you can. There's a lot to be learned from it, I think. And so, Steve, thank you.
Thank you
very much for your time.